Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is Beth Cameron. She served as Senior Director for Global Health Security and Biodefense at the National Security under Barack Obama. She helped also the transition to the incoming Trump administration. She currently serves as Vice President in charge of Global Biological Programs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Before we get to your assessment on the global Trump administration response to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, I just want to go over the controversy about some very senior public health officials being essentially pushed out of government by President Trump or being pushed to retract some of their statement about the pandemics. What's your take on this controversy?
Well, I think it's really important right now that scientists are front and center as communicators during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's critical that we maintain scientists and public health experts not only doing their jobs, but also communicating with the American public and with the global public. I don't know exactly what happened with the controversy that sort of started breaking in the United States last night about the head of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Agency. That's a really important agency in the United States government that oversees much of our work to advance drugs, therapeutics, vaccines for diseases like COVID-19. And so it's quite an important position. I really hope that it wasn't politicized in any way. And we'll have to see as the story unfolds exactly what did happen. But I really do think that it's important at this time to emphasize the importance of facts and scientists leading in these positions, and really making sure that everything that we're doing is based on public health guidance.
Right, because it does seem that the official who was pushed out, Rick Bright, said that he was pushed out because he opposed a treatment that President Trump advocated. So it would seem that it's essentially being pushed out or intimidated by the president, who might wish to see a different response from his top officials.
Yeah, if that's true, then it is certainly unfortunate and definitely not something that I would like to see within our government or any government around the world, especially when we're all trying to battle a pandemic and we really need our scientists and our fact-based communicators to be listened to and heard.
What's your assessment of the administration's response to this pandemic?
Well, I think there are definitely some challenges that we faced in our country, and we're not alone. Certainly, many countries that have a lot of capabilities around the world are struggling with this pandemic. I think that one of the large challenges that we faced in January and February in the United States was our inability to surge our testing capability. And so we had some challenges with diagnostic testing early on. We're still having challenges really surging that capability to have a much larger capacity to not only test, but also to follow all of the contacts of those that have symptoms so that we can quarantine and then isolate those who are infected. And that's really what's needed for us to be able to get out from under social distancing. I think the other challenge that we had, and again, I think we're not alone in this, is with the global supply chain for things like personal protective equipment and life-saving medical equipment like ventilators. What I'd love to see coming out of this pandemic, and even as we go forward through the next 12 to 18 months before we have a globally available safe vaccine, I'd really like to see more collaboration between the United States, our partners in Europe and around the world on things like sharing of personal protective equipment and supplies, developing a better manufacturing capability and sharing capability between us. I haven't seen enough communication between our government and governments in Europe and around the world on issues like that. And I think that would be extraordinarily helpful going forward.
Right. I want to go back. You headed this Global Health Security and Biodefense inside the National Security Council. It was established after the Ebola outbreak by the administration of Barack Obama. You left in 2017. The office was still in place until it was disbanded in 2018. The administration said it was merely streamlining. However, former Vice President Joe Biden, Democratic presidential candidate, it. Now, said in a tweet on March 19th that this directorate, which you headed, was made to prepare for such pandemics. Donald Trump, quote unquote, eliminated this, and now we're paying the price. You lift this from the inside. Is he right in saying that Donald Trump really hurt the federal response by disbanding or dissolving your office?
It was definitely one of the challenges that we had in early January and mid-January as this pandemic was unfolding. I think that there wasn't a senior level team whose only job was to handle pandemics in the White House. Now, President Trump, has stood up now a coronavirus task force, and I think that's a very good sign, with experts like Debbie Birx and Tony Fauci leading and helping to communicate on what needs to be done. But I definitely think that one of the major lessons coming out of the Ebola epidemic for our country and for governments around the world is that this issue of pandemic preparedness, global health security, it needs to be at the top of the heads of state agenda. And so coming out of the Ebola epidemic, President Obama, his National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, and his Homeland Security Advisor, Lisa Monaco, made a decision that we were going to stand up in office with direct communication between the head officials within the National Security Council to work on pandemic threats. And that in addition to that, we would have a deputy secretary level person within the White House whose responsibility it would be to respond to emerging pandemic threats. And so we were supposed to be the smoke alarm, looking, monitoring, considering issues and arising outbreaks that look different, that seemed like they could have pandemic potential. And then importantly, to be able to work with departments and agencies to anticipate challenges so that we weren't constantly reacting. So yes, I do think that time was lost. We are where we are now, and I would be willing to bet that coming out of this pandemic, there will be a permanent office within the White House that deals with these issues.
Right, because in addition, there was a whole National Security Council playbook, which you oversaw, some 69 pages. There was even a kind of a war games exercise with the incoming Trump administration about a potential pandemic just a week or so before the transition. It seems that all this work, all the structures that were put in place were essentially thrown away by the Trump administration.
I think that the Trump administration and many administrations before the Trump administration are looking at what's in front of them when they walk in the door. And one of the things that was especially confusing in this particular situation is that this was really, the issue of pandemics was highlighted as one of the top issues that needed to be paid attention to. And then for a year, there was attention paid to this issue by the Trump administration. The incoming Homeland Security Advisor, Tom Bossert, was very engaged and interested and worked deeply in the President Bush administration on pandemics. And so there was a continuation of this work. As you mentioned when you introduced me, I did work in this administration for 3 months as a civil servant. I was not a political appointee. And so it was especially confusing is when the office was disbanded and when it seemed like many of those strategies, which we really had hoped were ingrained across the federal government, weren't actually used.
Why? What happened?
I think it's an important lesson. It's really hard to say what happened not being on the inside of government. I can only speculate that it was hard for people who are left within the federal government. There are many biological experts left in our government, and looking at the news reports like everyone else, it really looked like they were providing some warnings, but it doesn't look like the senior level leaders in the White House were able to come together in a unified way to figure out what needed to be done beyond the issue of border closures. And border closures in the middle of a pandemic, while they can be helpful to consider in some cases, including potentially this one, for sure, we had cases already here in the United States when we were closing our borders. And so it's very clear that we weren't focused enough on the large-scale public health infrastructure that we really needed to stop community transmission.
Just as a last question, President Trump decided to cut funding for the World Health Organization. Is this a good decision? Because he says that this organization was too nice to China and did not sound the alarm.
cutting funding to the World Health Organization now is absolutely one of the last things that we should be doing. WHO is what the world is focused on. They are the UN agency in charge of dealing with COVID-19. And really importantly, they are the agency that low-resource countries around the world rely on, not only for response to COVID-19, but for so many other public health threats that still face the world: HIV/AIDS, polio, malaria, the list goes on and on. When we cut funding for the WHO, especially in the middle of a crisis, what we do is we make America and the rest of the world less safe and secure. And so I'd actually like to see much more emphasis not only on strengthening the WHO, which rightly should be done, but also on building accountability, increased transparency for sharing of public health information, and also launching something that my organization, NTI, has advocated for, a Global Health Security Challenge Fund, which would provide financing to fill many of the large-scale gaps that low-income countries have for dealing with pandemics like this one. I think we need to be focused on the future, even while we're in the middle of dealing with the crisis in front of us.
Beth Cameron, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for watching this edition of The Interview here on France 24.
Before the current crisis, pandemics have cropped up again and again, sometimes decimating entire populations. All this week, France 24 looks back at pandemics in history. The plague of Athens, the first ever recorded pandemic.
Une ville, une contrée, assaillie par l'épidémie, perd ses critères. Une épidémie met en cause tout le genre humain.
The Black Death, which swept across Western Europe. Cholera, which ravaged Asia before invading first Russia, then Europe. Spanish flu, the scourge whose origins are still unclear today.
La grippe s'est transmise très facilement dans les tranchées et la deuxième vague a été plus mortelle que la précédente.
And finally, AIDS, the catastrophe of which the world has yet to rid itself. These diseases, inexplicable in their time, can now be analyzed by scientists and treated with medicine. Don't miss Pandemics in History on France 24 and France24.com.
Fake news. Noun. False stories that appear to be news, spread on the internet or using other media. At France 24, our job is to provide you with information that's been verified. We check sources, we check facts, we sort what is true from what is fake.
At the France 24 Observers, we verify photos and videos circulating online. If they're fake, we let you know and tell you how we spotted them.
In Fact or Fake, we dig into viral stories around Europe to shake out the truth from the trash.
Every day, the Info Migrants team scours social networks to fight fake news about the reality of migration.
France 24, news based on facts.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.